This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Megan McArdle has written in The Atlantic, The Economist, The Guardian, The New York Post, Salon, Reason, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and other outlets. She describes her political views as right-leaning libertarian, and she often writes against government intervention in markets, industries, and economic activity. With the pandemic continuing to impact people's lives and transform economic activity, we talked to her about what she thinks the role of policy should and shouldn't be in terms of growing the economy, supporting science, and more. As a reminder, all of our events are taped 100% live. Anyone who wants to can join to ask a question. For more information about how to join us, our upcoming schedule, and past episodes, please visit us at pm101.live. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
But I'm wondering, through all of this turmoil where hundreds of millions of people have been impacted, has this changed your view on economic policy? Has this changed your general assumptions and paradigm that you view the economy through?
I don't think exactly. So I've always been, as libertarians go, I'm not much of a libertarian. I'm about as pro-government intervention as you can be and still reasonably call yourself a libertarian, which is to say that I like things like the FDIC that insures bank accounts and so forth. And I had always thought that there was a strong role for government in controlling infectious disease. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, I was definitely odd for libertarians saying we should just pay people to stay home, right? We need people to stay home. We didn't do a great job of that. And so in a way, interestingly, I think I would have assumed that the government would do better than it did. I certainly assumed that the CDC would do better than it did. I think most of us assumed that the CDC would not, for example, just screw up manufacturing tests for this virus and then refuse to let anyone use any other test, so that we spent more than a month just not even knowing how bad things were. I would have assumed a more competent state response. And so even though there are things that the pandemic has made me rethink, most notably supply chains, frankly, the way China is behaving with the Uyghurs and with Hong Kong has also made me rethink, do we need to think about what parts of our supply chain run through China that are critical? This is not an endorsement of kind of blanket trade restrictions or anything like that, but I think there's an argument that for some kinds of military defense, medical technology, that you do want to have those sourced here, even if that is not the maximally efficient way to do it. I think there are real drawbacks to that approach, and we can talk about that a bit if you like. But I'm at least theoretically open to that idea. But I will say this, is that the flip side of that is that the government underperformed my expectations. I think if you objectively look at which performed better during the pandemic, the private sector or the public sector, the private sector wins hands down.
Okay, so I want to get more into the private sector. You were saying it's done some really great stuff and it has done better than the public sector. I think of the private sector, though, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think of recently we don't have enough tests, and that in some part is due to private companies like Abbott destroying millions of tests because they didn't think they would be used. During the height of the pandemic, the Trump administration or the previous administration allowed for the free market to govern our PPE, and states were bidding up the cost of these materials and really needlessly wasting public funds because of the fundamental market dynamics. You had meatpacking plants stayed open because, quite frankly, they didn't give a shit if their workers got COVID and died. They really treated them in many inhumane ways. And in this case, the private sector was costing lives. So can you kind of speak to those massive market failures and maybe explain some examples where the private sector actually did really well? Because I'm just struggling to see them.
I think on the meatpacking plants, it is both true that they're not the best places to work and that there is a reason that immigrants work there. Americans won't, because the job is really unpleasant. Meat packers are not warm and fuzzy people who, as far as I know, love their employees and, treat them like family. But the meatpacking plants also had a special set of circumstances that was really not clear to anyone at the beginning of the pandemic. So as it turns out, viruses spread especially well in cold environments. And as we also now know, COVID especially spreads especially well in loud environments. I got dragged hideously for saying this at the beginning of the pandemic, in part because I phrased it badly. I said, what if noise is contributing to the COVID pandemic? And a bunch of people took that as me actually saying, what if noisy things give you COVID? No, what noise does is make you shout over the noise. And so the meatpacking plants, while I'm not arguing that they are the world's best employers, they were actually facing literally probably the worst possible combination of working conditions, which is that for obvious reasons, meatpacking plants have to be kept very cold. And they are extremely noisy because they are filled with heavy machinery like saws that is helping to cut up the animal carcasses into the meat that we buy in the store. And so some of it may well have been fecklessness, lack of caring about their employees, but a lot of it was simply that was just an environment in which it was particularly hard to control COVID. And we should remember that we ate that meat and we were pretty glad to get it. That's not to say that employers should not have done more in terms of PPE, but we also now know that PPE doesn't actually work. N95 masks work pretty well, but you couldn't get an N95 mask. When these epidemics were hitting the meatpacking plants, there was, I remember reading them, but people complaining they're not giving their employees N95 masks. Hospitals couldn't get N95 masks, and they wouldn't sell them to anyone who was not a hospital. And so the idea that they did not give their employees masks that were literally impossible to procure seemed a little unfair to me. We could have given them more gloves and more hand sanitizer, but in fact, as we now know, that was not something that really would have done a lot to help prevent the spread. The thing that helps prevent the spread is distancing or wearing an N95. And those were not things that employer was in a position to do. So I don't want to, be a Pollyanna here and just say this is all, the company was doing the absolute best possible job that they could. I don't know that. But I do think that you have to ask, should the meatpacking plants have shut down a critical part of the food supply chain, which would have had two knock-on effects. The first effect would have been that a bunch of farmers would have just slaughtered the animals and let the carcasses go to waste because they couldn't afford to continue to just indefinitely feed animals that they couldn't get paid for. And then, of course, we wouldn't have had any meat. And is that something that the meat packer should have done? Would we rather that the government or the market had sent that they had defied the market signal, which was saying, please provide us meat, and instead altruistically shut down the plants? A lot of people might have really suffered if we had lost, not just the ranchers, but also the people who needed the food. So I think these are really complicated questions, and the answers are rarely as obvious as we would like them to be.
Well over 20 million people quit their jobs in the second half of 2021. Some are calling it the Big Quit. Others, the Great Resignation.
But I wanted to switch over to the culture of work. For a long time in American culture, life has revolved around people's jobs. I'm wondering, I've read a lot of your columns on work. Has the pandemic, we've seen the Great Resignation and a bunch of other things, but has the pandemic changed the culture of work and the way that Americans view their job in relation to our self-identities?
In some ways, I think obviously, it's a lot harder to have one of these, my job is everything. It consumes every waking hour. It is the substitute for a social life and a family and all the other things I'm not having because I'm at work. When people are at home. And so I think in that way, yes, it's changing the culture of work, and it's changing. I think people discovered that things could be different, and they discovered that they liked it. They discovered that they liked not having to commute and all the rest of it. Some of the other things I'm less clear about. So the Great Resignation, I think, is a really interesting phenomenon, and I think it is clear that a bunch of people had what one economist called pandemic epiphanies, where they just realized, I hate my job, I want something better. The question is, and I've asked a bunch of labor economists this, and I've not yet gotten a really good, clear answer on it. It's not enough to think, I don't like the job I was doing, I need to do something different, right? A lot of the jobs people are leaving are not jobs that I've worked as a hotel maid. I didn't like it. I went back to college for a reason. I did not want to be cleaning hotel rooms when I was 30. And so a lot of those jobs just aren't very pleasant. And you can absolutely see why people said, enough. I don't want to put up with the customers, the rude, the bosses and all the rest of it. I want to do something better paid, more pleasant, all the rest of it. But those jobs, the fact that I want to do something different doesn't make the job exist for me to do. And that is we still shaking out. If a bunch of people leave their jobs, as in hospitality is I think a major area where people just are fed up. I think in part because customers have just kind of objectively become worse. You see this all over with bartenders and servers and so forth, just complaining that the customers are way worse than they used to be. And I think I think it's real. I don't think they're just making that up. But do we have a bunch of better jobs that, 100,000 hotel workers can do? I don't know. It's not a skeptical, like, haha, they're ridiculous. It's just I actually don't know. I don't think they know either. And there's an argument that if we're going to upskill these workers, they're going to go back to school, they're going to learn to do something else. But I actually don't even know. It really depends on whether you think there's a lot of room for people to gain new skills and a lot of high paying or better paying, at least, more rewarding, more opportunities for remote work or whatever else it is that the pandemic made them decide they wanted. Are those jobs, are companies going to create those jobs? I don't know.
You wrote a column comparing Biden to transformational presidents like FDR, Reagan, judging that it would be near impossible for him to have that kind of impact. You kind of summed it up saying you need to have talent along with circumstance. But something that made these presidents such landmarks was how they fundamentally reshaped paradigms in economic policy. In order to be a figure of that historical stature, you need to introduce big new ideas. I want to get your opinion. Where do you see these kind of new ideas coming from today?
I don't see as many new ideas as I would like to. And a lot of the new ideas that I do see are bad. Things like modern monetary theory, which I think has not panned out as some of its advocates, its more recent adapters hoped. Things like the universal basic income, which I think, looking in communities where lots of people don't work, I think that the kind of both the practical problems of finding enough money to give people a universal basic income they could actually live on, the effects, the bad incentives it would give in terms of, for example, allowing immigrants in, that would be very unpopular if they or their children were going to become eligible for the UBI. But also the fact that if you go to places where a lot of people don't work, they're not good places to live. They're sad places. My mom's from Western New York. There's a lot of those towns. And the residents there will say, our town is dying. Why? And work is weirdly fundamental. Maybe it shouldn't be, right? I can tell this happy story where we don't work and we all sit around in trees singing songs to each other. But in fact, what people mostly do, we have people like Eric Hurst have done work on time use surveys. In fact, what they mostly do is they watch television and sleep and play video games. And so I think a lot of the kind of big ideas that are coming out are not good, or they're unrealistic. I am someone, I believe global warming is happening. I support government intervention. to do something about it, ideally in the form of a carbon tax. But the Democratic big ideas on this are so wildly beyond what can be sold to the U.S. electorate that they functionally might as well not bother having the ideas in the first place, because they're never, ever going to happen. We are never, ever going to sell Americans on a future where they have to meaningfully reduce their energy usage and live in smaller homes that are not as well heated, enjoy less air conditioning, not be able to drive where they want when they want. That's not a vision you're going to sell Americans on. And if you can't sell Americans on it, you can't make it happen through politics. There are things in politics, as you know, if you've worked as a lobbyist, right? There are things in politics you can do through lobbying that are not popular. But the way you have to do them is that you have to have a block of incredibly intense voters, or your provision has to be so tiny that no one cares. You can push through a lot of weird tax breaks that no one understands. You can soothe the retail industry by messing around with the interchange fees on our debit cards, because no one understands what that is except for like 3 financial writers. But you cannot make any law that is going to require Americans to not drive their cars. That's not part of the solution set. Not arguing about whether it should be or not, it just isn't. And so Democrats have a lot of ideas like that. And then on the Republican side, they're kind of not in the business of doing policy. They're kind of in the business of just saying no a lot. And I think that may be starting to change.
So let's go to our audience questions. We're going to go to Megan, who is probably watching Alabama football, and then we will go to Neely. Megan, over to you. Roll Tide.
Thanks, Megan, for coming, and really appreciate you joining us tonight. I'm curious, as Build Back Better seems to be on the rocks and suffering from an uncertain fate. I'm curious whether you think that any of the provisions of that bill would actually help the country's economic situation, whether there are those that you think would be particularly harmful. And then I'd really like to hear, just your take on the likelihood that it probably won't pass like it is, but what could potentially pass before the midterms. Thanks.
So I'm not sure helps the economic situation is the right way to look at the bill. I know that a lot of Democrats will disagree with that. For one thing, I actually tend to agree that I tend to think that the government has very limited power to make the economy bigger, especially outside of the short run. If you're in the middle of a financial crisis, as we were in 2008, or in a pandemic, as we just were, then I think the government can kind of temporarily smooth huge dislocations and prevent cascades that make everything a lot worse. So I think at that point, there is a case that the government is actually increasing the size of the overall economy. But outside of those emergencies, I think the evidence that governments know how to do anything to increase the size of the overall economy is pretty thin, especially in developed countries that are at kind of the technology frontier. If you're a country like China or Japan in 1945, the government can come in and kind of wildly subsidize exports. And I think that, and push a really export-oriented growth strategy that can work. It doesn't always work, to be clear. There's actually a ton of examples of it abjectly failing. But it can work. But the problem is that eventually you just hit a point where you need to develop your own domestic economy. And the tools that got you to that point are actually really badly suited and make it harder to get to that next economic stage. And so you often see these things backfiring and these countries kind of ending up trapped in middle income status and never quite making it over the top. But I don't think that our government has a lot of scope for making the economy bigger than it would be. What it has scope for doing is helping people who need help and redistributing money from people who have it to people who we think could use it better than the people who have it now. And I think that there are priorities that the government may be able to help with. For example, there's money it's not a huge amount of money, but there's the Biden administration has been pushing to install electric vehicle charging stations. And I think that that's something where the government can help, because In fact, you have a network problem with electric vehicles you actually didn't even have with gasoline cars.
We will go to Jim and then Aram. Jim, good friend. It's been too long.
Fantastic commentary, Megan. One kind of a question, comment, wanted to get your feedback. What I've noticed is someone who's been a virtual worker in a relatively specialized white collar field for 12 years and especially observing it the last 2, and then having a household of workers that are all focused on that local economy type thing, is that I think your commentary was great. But what I kind of notice is that the virtual worker pool, while perhaps nationwide, tends to be far more specialized in terms of the skill sets they're looking for versus the generalist associated with a local laborer or waitress or something like that. Have you noticed any dimensions in that or considered any of that as a factor in terms of your analysis? Appreciate your feedback.
I think that's absolutely right. Although I would say, remember, there's a lot of, for example, call center workers who are working remotely, now often working in Bangladesh or the Philippines rather than the United States. And I should say, too, that is a caution for people who get super excited about the idea of all remote work and people living anywhere. As more than one executive has said to me, if I can outsource your job to Nashville, I can probably outsource your job to Bangladesh. And so I'm not even sure that the whole idea of a completely virtual workplace is going to, outside of some specialized fields where you really have to be a U.S. citizen because it relies on kind of cultural fit. I think journalism, thankfully, is one of those. But things like law, where you need a law degree and to have passed the bar. But for a lot of industries, if you can outsource yourself to a different city, you might eventually see your employer outsource your job to another country. But I think there are actually a surprising number of remote workers who are doing something that's fairly interchangeable. However, I think that overall you are correct. That most people who are working remotely, they're skilled workers. They tend to be in a fairly narrow rate. If you think about someone like me, now I've been working remotely basically since 2006, 2007, when I showed up in the Washington office of The Economist, and the office manager told me she didn't have a desk for me.
We'll go to Aram, and then we'll go to Mr. Gregory Sattel. Aram, over to you.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks, Megan, for being here. I'm glad you're here because I actually remember a column that you did about prescription drugs a while ago, and that's been really top of mind for me, particularly with the battle over prescription drug negotiation that's been going on in the latest round of legislation. And I remember in your piece that you're making the point that R&D is something that pharmaceutical companies do when it makes more economic sense than other activities. And that feels really different to me than what actually I think happens in this country, where a huge amount of research and development, particularly in pharmaceuticals, but also in, say, DARPA inventing the internet or lots of other examples, that research actually comes out of the government. And I'm wondering if that's, if you disagree with that, or if you don't see that as a way that the government's actually helping make the economy bigger. Curious what your thoughts are, and thanks for being here.
Yes, I should say that I do think that some government spending on research and development does make the economy bigger, and I am happy to support it. So I would say this is, I think there's a really unhelpful tendency among people who support more active government role in regulating pharmaceutical prices, which I oppose. I should cards on the table, but I think there are various arguments that aren't crazy in favor of it. But there's an unhelpful tendency to talk as if, this is really all about government research, and all the pharmaceutical companies are doing is slapping a label on the thing, and sending cheerleaders out to persuade doctors to prescribe it. And that's really wrong. And you see that with the vaccines. What those companies had been doing for a decade before anything came along was sort of trying to figure out how to make this thing into something that you could put into people. So, there's a partnership between government and academia on the one side that do basic research, and between pharmaceutical firms that do applied research, that do the applied research that turns the targets that academics identify into actual drugs. And there's a lot of stuff that's just not that appealing to academics about turning something into a drug. And I think that you actually even see this in the difference between Pfizer and Moderna. So Pfizer is partnered with BioNTech, which has one of these mRNA vaccines. And then you have Moderna kind of going it alone with the other vaccine. And one of the things that I think you see is that Moderna ended up just going through the regulatory process slower than Pfizer did. And it's not because their vaccine took longer to get together. Both companies had a vaccine prototype within days of getting the DNA of the COVID-19 virus. It's that Moderna doesn't have experience going through regulatory approvals, doesn't have experience setting up the trials, so that they, and so Pfizer just knew how to do those things faster, and so they got their product to market faster. Getting your stuff through the FDA is itself a major, major hurdle, which is why big pharma persists, even though a lot of drugs get invented at much smaller biotech firms. Those firms don't have the assets to get it through 3 stages of incredibly expensive clinical trials, do all the paperwork for the FDA, know what the FDA is going to want before they ask for it, and then get it out into doctors and tell doctors what the drug is and what it does. All of that stuff has to happen, and that's not stuff the government is good at doing. And the other things that are proposed, for example, using a prize. So instead of saying anyone who can get to market can get a patent, and then they can charge whatever they want, you say the United States government is going to put up $2 billion to produce a good new treatment that meets these goals. And the first company to hit that gets the $2 billion. That's an alternative way that I would be very open to thinking about trying to fund pharmaceutical research. There is also an argument from people like Dean Baker that the government should just directly do pharmaceutical research, not the basic research that they fund now, but the applied research that makes a drug and produces it. I'm not averse to that. Maybe the government could do it.
Mr. Gregory Sattel, over to you.
Thanks, Justin, I think, and thanks for joining us, Megan. I heard you on an interview years ago where you were kind of musing about this idea of abolishing the corporate tax, which, if I remember correctly, you didn't think is a very good idea, and I don't think it's realistic that it would ever happen. But we do have a problem in our tax code where debt is favored over equity, and that does seem to affect corporate decision making. Especially with respect to corporate, borrowing money for corporate buybacks over dividends, for instance, and in that way probably injects a fair amount of risk into our economy. Would you agree with that assessment? And if so, what could or should we do about it?
So you have actually, I am actually a radical who thinks that the corporate income tax should be done away with. I might keep a kind of token tax only in order to produce 1% or something, only in order to force companies to produce corporate tax returns for the purposes of ascertaining that people are not using their businesses in order to shield personal income, right? Which is something that was pretty common and certainly in the 70s before the tax code changed and under Reagan. And so I think that there is a bias towards equity financing, although I think there are other reasons for the bias that aren't just tax reasons. There are also the fact that, especially entrepreneurs, that a lot of companies will want to take on debt rather than equity simply because they like the finite obligation rather than the open-ended obligation to pay, to give some part of the residual profits to shareholders every year ad infinitum. But that said, I think that the corporate income tax, this is just one of the many, many distortions the corporate income tax produces. There are entire industries that are devoted to just helping companies transform something that they're doing into something that looks exactly the same but is taxed at a lower rate. And this is completely useless activity. It is consuming too many brilliant minds devoting themselves to figuring out how to lower income taxes. And it doesn't even do what people who say that they want corporations to pay their fair share to do. Because the truth is, a corporation can't pay taxes. A corporation is just people. At the end of the day, the company doesn't have wants or desires. It does not give any money that you take comes out of the pocket of some real person. It comes out of the pocket of a shareholder or an employee or a customer or a vendor. And by the way, the incidence of that tax is often very much not what you would like. People tend to think of the tax as exclusively falling on managers or shareholders, but often it falls on ordinary workers. But the billionaire is paying that same share of the corporate income tax as on each of his shares as a poor person. Whereas if you were taxing income when it was realized by an actual person, that widow would be paying very little tax and the billionaire would be paying a lot of tax. And that is as it should be. And so I think that the corporate income tax is just a bad tax. It exists not because it is structurally sound or good for the economy or even particularly progressive. It exists because we have this weird conviction that there is some way to get tax revenue that does not involve taking it from a human being. And unfortunately, if that human being is a citizen, a human being who will get angry when you take their money and vote against you. And so these things poll well with voters because they don't really think through how the incidence is working out and the fact that at the end of the day, you're always taking it from a person. And it would be way more effective to just eliminate the middleman and take it from the person directly. And that would not only give us a more progressive system, but it would eliminate a lot of these distortions, like the tendency to take on a bunch of debt, like the tendency to do all of various things that are subsidized in the tax code, like the tendency to, try to push employee fringe benefits as much as possible through these tax advantage things like health insurance. All of that would go away if we didn't have the corporate income tax in there creating all of these distortions and this completely useless structuring activity.
I just wanted to give it over to you for last thoughts, if you had any, and then we will close down the room.
Gosh, I'm not sure I have any deep thoughts, except that we are in a rare moment in history. Much more than any other time, I think, in my lifetime. I've lived now through, 9/11, the financial crisis and so forth. But I think the pandemic has unsettled America more than it has been at any other point, where more weird things are possible in both a bad and in a good direction. And, the bad is things like January 6th, but the good direction is like remote work and changing the face of cities and rethinking our patterns of living and working. And so I think that for all our distress about the bad parts, it is a pretty exciting time to be alive and observing politics. So I, for one, am glad that I'm living through it.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Megan for coming out, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. If you like what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live, ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, visit our website, pm101.live, where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team. Thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.